employees more towards the bottom of the pyramid, if you want management to have a clue, you have to do the work to give them a clue. And as management, right, to create a culture of escalation, what that means is you need to welcome being given a clue, right? So those are the two responsibilities. If you don't want to have clueless management, this is the only way it's going to happen.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is an educational episode, in-depth masterclasses about the concepts essential to building, running, and investing in Silicon Valley-style startups. Whether you're a founder, investor, or operator in a startup, you'll gain insights into the principles that power high-growth disruption, the same way Facebook, Google, and Uber do it. The conversation starts now.
Hey, I'm Chris Saad.
And I'm Yaniv Bernstein.
Welcome to today's episode. Today we're going to talk about escalation. Might sound like a boring, dry topic, but it's actually one of the most essential mechanisms for a great culture and a great distributed org that can make decisions at the edge and move fast and break things. We're going to specifically talk about what the heck is escalation? Why is escalation important? Why is it difficult to do and often avoided? How to escalate well and receive escalation well, and how to create a general culture of escalation across your company that makes it effective, makes it part of the fabric, and ultimately helps you be a really effective company. All that and much, much more on this week's show. Stay tuned.
Whether you're starting or scaling your company's security program, demonstrating top-notch security practices and establishing trust is more important than ever. Vanta automates compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. And it gets even better. Just for TSP listeners, you can get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off.
Now, before we get started, of course, we're going to talk about the Startup Podcast Pact, which says if you've listened to a few of our shows and gotten value, we only ask for a few things in return: to follow us and subscribe to us in your favorite podcasting app and on YouTube, and to give us a shout out on your favorite social network. It helps us grow the show, helps us get better guests, and helps us help more founders. So thanks very much for doing that. All right, Yaniv, let's dive straight into it. The first thing we need to talk about is what the heck is escalation?
At the very core, when we say escalation, what we're saying is when there are problems, when there are matters that are happening within the organization, they need to be brought to their leader's attention for information or action. In other words, you're on your team and something happens, you need to tell your leader about it, but not just any time. There's a right way of doing it, and that's what we're going to talk about here. Let's just quickly go through some of the different types of escalation. There's 4 big kinds that we think of, and that is raising problems, right? Saying, hey, we've got this fire burning on our team, and you as a leader should be aware of that. Raising problems. The next, seeking assistance. We on our team are dealing with a challenge, and we're not quite sure how to solve it. We need help, or we don't have the resources we need to solve it. We need help. The next is resolving conflicts. My team and Team B cannot agree on the way forward here. We are kind of in a deadlock and we need your help to help resolve that conflict. And the fourth is asking for decisions, which is we are blocked because we don't know whether to go left or right. There are pros and cons. We feel that making that decision is above our pay grade. We need you to make that decision for us so that we can then be unblocked and proceed. We call it escalation because these are things that you cannot solve on your own, or these are things that people above you in the organizational hierarchy need to be aware of to be able to do their jobs well. And therefore, and this is a really key thing, escalation should be part of everybody's job.
You talk about problems. These problems can be things like, hey, there is insufficient staff here. There's insufficient resources. There's a dysfunction occurring, right? Seeking assistance might be simply like, hey, we'd love you guys to chime in. You're pretty good at this. That's why you're the leaders. We'd like to supercharge our thinking. Resolving conflicts is a really big one. That might be where you have 2 very well-meaning people. Let's say a product manager in squad A, a product manager in squad B, and they both have different OKRs, different perspectives, different missions, and they both are basically right from their point of view, but they can't figure out which trade-off to make between them. And so they need to escalate to their manager because the manager typically has the privilege of a higher point of view, a higher vantage point, and can help give the right kind of context and help make the right kind of trade-offs. And then finally, of course, asking for decisions. Some decisions are just simply above your pay grade. The leadership team needs to chime in, and that's why it's essential to do that. The point about resolving conflicts is really, really important because these are not just interpersonal conflicts where person A doesn't like person B. That's hopefully a rare occurrence. This is more about a difference in perspective, a difference in mission, a difference in OKRs between different squads or different groups in the company. And when you've empowered those teams to be autonomous, to have missions they're quite closely aligned to or emotionally attached to, and they have a very particular vantage point, these kinds of trade-offs, these conflicts, these differences of opinions will actually happen quite regularly, and very naturally. These are not bugs, they're features. And so it's important to recognize that escalation is part of the way that these kind of distributed organizations work. I want to make that very clear because I think in certain cultures and in certain companies, escalation can be seen as like going to the teacher and telling on your friend in high school or something. And that's not what it is. So that's what escalation is and some examples of the reasons people might escalate. Let's now go really deep into why escalation is particularly important in distributed, highly autonomous organizations. When you have these cross-functional teams that are running relatively independently, and you have empowered your individuals and your teams to make decisions within their domains and within their missions, the advantage of that kind of structure is that people get to believe in and drive and be accountable for a mission. But the disadvantage is that there might be silos or balkanization that occurs, and leaders are not really aware of what's happening at lower levels. And so escalation is important for all kinds of organizations, but it's especially important for organizations that are organized as cross-functional autonomous squads with empowered employees. It is one of the most essential mechanisms to making that kind of organization work and work really, really well.
It's nearly about communications flows within a company. If you consider a command and control sort of organization, this is from the industrial era, where you divide it into divisions and you have like different levels of management that are basically giving orders downstream, then escalation is less important, or at least it's more exceptional, right? Because basically every unit of the organization has its orders to carry out, and it's their job to carry out those orders. And there shouldn't be a lot of thinking or a lot of conflict and so on, because it's simply they have a job to do, they should do it. So escalation is something that is quite rare. And by the way, this is, I think, the mindset my least favorite bit of management advice comes from, which is people say, when somebody comes to me with a problem, I say to them, don't come to me with a problem, come to me with a solution. And I fucking hate that, right? And that's because it's basically saying, if I've given you orders, it's your job to figure out how to carry out those orders. You should have all the context and all the authority you need to carry out those orders. That might be true in a command and control environment. But now we're moving to a model where we're putting a lot more autonomy, a lot more empowerment, a lot more decision-making power at the leads, right? At the individual organizational units. So suddenly, they're not just carrying out orders, they're solving problems for the business, which is great. We talk about why that's really important in a high uncertainty environment, Chris. But what it also means is suddenly there are a lot of things that happen that it's not fully within their control or knowledge to solve or to resolve. So in other words, you're going from an environment, command and control, where you have this one-way flow of information, to an environment where you really need a two-way flow of information. And the thing is, the default form of communication is still from the top down. It's still saying, okay, here are OKRs, here's what you should be focusing on. And then the question is, okay, but how do we communicate things back up? When unexpected things happen, which they'll be happening all the time in this uncertain environment, how do we communicate back up in order to have a functional system of communication? And that back up communication, that is really what we mean when we talk about escalation.
It's a key tool for maintaining alignment in these autonomous organizations, right? There's this planning cycle. The business figures out what the key high-level OKRs are. They communicate that to everybody. The squads, these autonomous business units, come back with their own OKRs, their own roadmaps, their own plans, and their own intention to learn, iterate, and adapt over time. But what can happen is that these teams become balkanized, they become myopic, or their plans become at conflict with each other, or there's often this strategic drift where plans change, plans evolve, and they kind of move off the central axis. And so the first and probably one of the most important reasons to escalate is it's an opportunity for people at the rung below to check in with their leader and say, hey, here's what we're doing, here's what we're seeing, here's some challenges we're going through. And for that leader to go, hey, actually, this feels misaligned with your original plan. This feels misaligned with what some of the other squads are doing. This feels misaligned with the business level OKRs. And so it's an opportunity for the leader to maintain and ensure alignment with a portfolio of squads and vice versa.
And, you talked about balkanization, and just going back to the points that I was making just before, Chris, this is to do with the type of organization that you're running. Because if you're a command and control, balkanization isn't a problem, right? If you're running a supermarket chain, by the way, if anyone's listening and works in supermarkets, they'll probably tell me I'm wrong. But I'm like, if I run a supermarket in San Francisco and you run a supermarket in Seattle or whatever it is, we don't need to communicate with each other, right? We each get our orders from above from the divisional chief or whatever, and we run our supermarket the way we need to run it. So what that means is if we have a problem in our shop, we solve it. Am I going to have a conflict with you in Seattle? No, I'm not, because we don't have anything to do with each other, right? We've actually divided up the space in a way that's nice and clean and minimized the interdependencies. But when we talk about empowered, autonomous teams operating in an environment of high uncertainty, and that is where startups operate, then those interdependencies are pretty significant, right? Therefore, we need to be able to have ways of resolving conflicts and resolving overlaps between different teams. Also, if we're empowering the teams, that means that folks on the ground are going to be learning lots of new things all the time. And if they don't tell leadership about those things, then leadership is operating in the dark. And that is why when we talk about empowered teams, I think about hierarchy and what hierarchy means in different contexts. You still have hierarchy. One of the things I dislike is when people draw that, the management, that hierarchy pyramid, and they're like, we're turning it upside down because we do service leadership and leaders are at the bottom. Well, that's bullshit. Why? One of the things that is important about this hierarchy, I like to think about it, is gravity. Information flows down. Orders flow down, right? That is the natural order of things. And that means that all of the information, by default, is going to pull at the bottom of the hierarchy. And in a command and control situation, that's okay, right? Because a hierarchy has nothing meaningful to contribute back to leadership. But in this sort of service leadership empowered model, well, the bottom of the hierarchy needs to communicate upwards with its leadership. And that means it's fighting gravity. And that's why it is important and it is hard to fight that gravity and make sure the important information, the important decisions are getting to the leaders who are the right people to be helping with them.
The other reason escalation is really important is that when escalation occurs, right, two PMs of well-meaning different perspectives escalate to a leader, it provides an opportunity for that leader to reinforce the goals and provide additional context and guidance to those two or more PMs. So they can go, hey, remember this thing that we talked about, guys? This is the thing that really matters. Or, hey, I just heard from another different PM that they're working on this. You guys should double check and check in with them because there's some situational awareness you don't have around that. It is an opportunity for leadership to reinforce context, reinforce guidance, and to maintain situational awareness across the org and repopulate or reinforce that guidance and that context across the org. And so, as you say, Yaniv, these organizations need two-way data flows. And so the escalation is data up, but it also gives more context and data to the leaders that they can then recycle through the rest of the org. It's very, very important.
Exactly right. And that's the way to think about it, right? We have a pyramid. Just to reinforce, I think hierarchy is real and it's not even bad. But when you have a hierarchy where you create a great degree of empowerment at the bottom, you need to have that two-way communication flow and you need to model it.
Another reason I really like escalation is when one or more of my PMs bring something to me, I'll often use it as a teachable moment to discuss not just that specific case, but a principle or a pattern or a way of thinking that I think the team should be adopting and observing generally. And so either in that specific escalation amongst those specific people, or then later at let's say the weekly product leadership meeting, I'll talk about, hey, this is an escalation that occurred this week. Here's a generalized principle the next time you encounter this category of question. And so I'll very regularly have a kind of part of my regular chief product officer weekly sync, a kind of philosophy corner or a principle corner where I'll go, hey guys, don't forget this particular principle. I've seen a couple of times this week or this month where the principle's been forgotten or poorly applied. Let's walk through that principle and up-level our general reasoning and thinking about these problems for the long term. And so it really creates a lot of teachable moments as well.
I've been on both sides of it. When you're an employee, you're like, oh, why is management so clueless? Why does management not get it? And then when you're a manager, suddenly you realize why management doesn't get it, which is like, it is impossible to know everything that's going on unless people tell you, right? Like As a manager, you have no magic superpowers. You don't have X-ray specs. You don't have the ability to be in every meeting. And so without wanting to put the responsibility on the employees more towards the bottom of the pyramid, if you want management to have a clue, you have to do the work to give them a clue. And as management, right, to create a culture of escalation, what that means is you need to welcome being given a clue, right? So those are the two responsibilities. You want management to understand what's happening. You need to have an open channel of communication with them. If you as management want your teams to have an open channel of communication with you so you can learn what's happening, so you can teach them, so you can course correct, so you can provide guidance, you need to welcome that. You need to create a culture where that is not just tolerated, but encouraged and rewarded ultimately. And that is why escalation is important. If you don't want to have clueless management, this is the only way it's going to happen.
Escalation sounds pretty damn awesome at this point, hopefully. You're listening to this and you're going, yes, escalation, that sounds great. We need to do more of that. The question then becomes, well, why doesn't escalation happen more often? Why is it difficult? Why is it done rarely? And why is it done poorly? The answer is there's a lot of gravity, as you described, Yaniv, that's working against escalation. It's probably best to bucket this gravity into two broad buckets: cultural factors and psychological factors. So let's talk about cultural factors first. There are many cultures, just general society cultures, right, in various countries, and also corporate cultures, company cultures, where there is a high power distance culture, where there's a lot of deference to authority. Perhaps the most obvious and stark example of this is a communist country like China, where people in government go, this is the way the world works, and general citizens go, yes, sir, thank you very much, right? This tends to happen in some companies, and it happens in a softer or more subtle way in certain countries. I know, for example, in Australia, there tends to be a little bit of like, the leader said to do something, that probably sounds generally right. Let's not question it too much. We don't want to stand out too much. We don't want to be a tall poppy, right? We don't want to step on toes. Actually, one of the first things I said when I joined Uber in my first week is, I have a good idea here, but I don't want to step on that team's toes. And I was immediately disabused of that nomenclature. They were like, hang on, stop. Our cultural value here is that you step on toes. If you see something, say something, go talk to them and go share your perspective, right? And so that's a difference in relationship to authority or relationship to each other. That's the first major reason, is that there are cultures, both in countries and in companies, that tend to dissuade or diminish or shy away from speaking truth to power.
Yeah, and there's a fantastic book by somebody called Erin Mayers called The Culture Map, which is where this concept of power distance was well articulated there. And she talks about 6 different cultural factors that vary across countries, but you're right, Chris, they also vary across companies in a way that's sort of additive. And power distance is one of them. But the point is that if you have high power distance, it's high respect for authority, that gets in the way. Power distance exists in every culture, actually, right? Just to a greater or lesser extent, where the person with more power will tend to be deferred to by the person with less power. And that's that gravity I speak of. It's kind of a law of human nature, is that power tends to give you the authority to speak and to be listened to. That's one of the things that constitutes power. And so you're already needing to work against that human social tendency.
I'm finding myself reminding teams that I work with over and over and over again, escalate, right? They'll mention something that they're stuck doing kind of in passing almost. And I'll be like, why have you not escalated that? Like, why have you not set up a meeting where I can participate in that conversation and help you resolve it? And they're like, oh, we were working on it. And I'm like, yeah, but you've been working on it for 3 weeks, right? Escalate. This is not a problem at all. The next major cultural reason that people tend to avoid escalation is that they're inside a consensus-driven culture. Now, this is slightly different than high power distance. High power distance is kind of a concern about speaking truth to power or taking the word of power as gospel. Consensus-driven tends to be more about peering, right? Where you get groups of people together, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 people, and the effort is not to find the truth, but rather to find the thing that is palatable to everyone. And so people are going to go around and around in circles trying to find that, and sometimes almost never finding it and never making a hard decision. And decisions get kind of twisted, diluted, and dissolved, and they take too long, they tend to be too mediocre, and they tend to just try to route around possible means or reasons for conflict. That's just not a good way to make decision making, right? We've all heard about this idea of design by committee. You do not want to design by committee. You want to design by first principles and truth seeking and finding the best possible answer to a given problem or challenge. And so that requires assertiveness within a peer group, but also very often escalation to a manager.
And in particular, I would say consensus-driven cultures have difficulty escalating conflicts, right? Because conflicts are seen as bugs rather than features when you have a consensus-driven culture, right? We should all be on the same page. So if we're not on the same page, that goes against the culture. And then to escalate that, to say we are not agreeing, and then looking for someone to make a decision for you rather than trying to reach some sort of consensus, goes against the culture. And what might happen in a culture like that is if team A and team B, I'm team A, of course, Chris, you can be team B. We disagree with each other and we escalate it to our manager's going to be like, work it out, go achieve a consensus. Instead of saying team A, of course, is right as usual, and you should just do what team A says, the manager is going to push back down and say, go achieve a consensus. And that can be really problematic when, the consensus is just like a messy average that basically has all of the flaws of both solutions and none of the advantages of either.
Yeah, that's right. And that's a really important point you make, Yaniv, which is it's not just the peers who are working towards a consensus. It's a leader who keeps punting back to the peers and going, well, I don't know, you guys figure it out, which is related to the whole bring me solutions, don't bring me problems, right? And it's like, no, as a leader, ideally you have better taste and judgment because you have a longer storied history or experience in the domain. But at the very least, you have a higher vantage point. And so you should be in a position to be right more often. And you should be in a position to make tie breaks and to make good decisions that are not the middling average of some consensus somewhere.
Even further than that, even if you don't have better taste or a higher vantage point, what you have is power and authority. And, I'd love us to do an episode on power sometime because I think it's often used as this negative word, but it's neutral. Power is neutral. It simply exists. And quite often, just any decision is better than no decision, is better than a consensus decision, right? And so even if the manager flips a coin, you're often better off having that decision made in that way than kind of just pushing towards an unpleasant consensus. I think quite often, culture, again, I want to put a point on this because it's important. A lot of it is about power. And that's why when I talk about hierarchy, quite often when people talk about these empowered teams and autonomy and so on, and then they invert the freaking pyramid, what they're trying to pretend is that power doesn't exist anymore, but actually it does. And so if you want to have autonomous teams working well together, what you need to do is acknowledge the power and use it appropriately, not to pretend that it's not there or that it flows in the opposite direction from the direction it actually does, because that will introduce all of these distortions, right? It is often the job of leadership to make difficult decisions because they have the power and the authority to make them. But if they are never offered the opportunity to make those decisions, that's when things go wrong.
Absolutely. Companies are not egalitarian. Companies are dictatorships. The question is only where autonomy and accountability lives. And in a startup and in a scale-up, it needs to be at the edges because of the learning machine and the rapid iteration. But you have to understand your power and the power to end hedging and endless debate. You have to make decisions, especially those two-door decisions, Yaniv. I like what you just said there, which is flip a coin. Just end the debate, make stuff happen, execute faster. It's really that simple. Okay, the next bucket of reasons that escalation is difficult is psychological factors. These are kind of the stuff that's going on in individuals' heads. Right? Obviously, culture is the soup that we all live in together, and it's interpersonal. The psychological factors tend to be just in one person's head, the person who maybe is in the position or sees the problem and is going to hesitate to escalate on their own behalf. So the first psychological factor here is simply fear of confrontation, right? If I have a challenge with a peer, a well-meaning challenge, we have a difference of perspective, or if I have a challenge with my manager or management, I don't necessarily want to escalate that because I don't want to be in conflict with someone, right? And I just want to get along. I don't want to rock the boat. I don't want to be in a difficult conversation. I don't want to have that emotional turmoil. I don't want my adrenaline to run. I want an easy day. I want an easy week. I don't want to risk getting fired. This is also a bit of a meta culture thing. Some cultures, I think, have more aversion to this than others, both country and corporate cultures. But this is in your own head. People generally just want to avoid conflict.
Yeah. And again, there's a lot of overlap between these psychological and cultural factors. It relates to these power distance and consensus issues. But even separate from that, it is simply human psychology. And again, escalation, if left to its own devices, people will quickly interpret it as being more like a running to mummy or daddy, right? This idea of saying, instead of being able to solve my own problems, I am running up to someone else with authority, especially in conflict situations. But not only, that is going to seem confrontational. It runs a little bit against human nature, against human psychology. And so yes, again, if you do not actively cultivate a culture of this, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this episode, Chris, then the default is people are going to be like, I could escalate this, but that might be unpleasant. So I just kind of won't. Like, I could escalate it, but I'm a bit afraid of the confrontational aspect of it, of grappling, having potentially an uncomfortable conversation with somebody who has more power than me. So instead of doing it, I will simply not do it, right? The default is inaction, and our psychological biases here push us even further towards that default.
I, in the early days at Uber, was in a very contentious and confrontational situation where what I wanted to work on was at odds with what a lot of other people wanted to work on or wanted to see in the app. I spent weeks and weeks and weeks trying to deal with it at my level because I was not familiar with these kind of larger distributed organizations and the process of escalation. And when it finally got to the CEO, to Travis, he was like, man, you should have just escalated this to me ages ago. And I said, as we're talking about here, I said, well, I just don't want to run to daddy every time there's a problem. And he's like, no, you don't get it. This is my job. This is what I'm here to do. I'm absolutely here to get your back. Just keep escalating this back to me as you're running into problems because we need to do it your way and we need to solve this. Just like this whole toe stepping thing, it was like mind opening for me where I thought great leadership at my level was to just handle it and to not take it to my manager, take it to someone else to handle for me. And it just couldn't have been further from the truth. We had an earnest and well-meaning conflict of interest between the various squads, and it just needed somebody at a high level to resolve. And it was scary. It was scary to go talk to Travis about this stuff, right? It's scary to talk to your boss about this stuff. And it actually ended up in a number of very unpleasant, very anxiety-riddled meetings. But that's what needed to happen for the good of the company.
Exactly. And so that brings us to the next one, Chris, which is just piles on it even further, which is previous negative experiences. So we already have our cultural factors, our psychological fear of confrontation. What's going to make that worse is if you have overcome that fear, overcome those cultural biases, you've escalated and you've been slapped down for it, right? Because then your fear has become a reality, which is, again, coming back to don't come to me with problems, come to me with solutions. Managers don't understand how toxic that is because if somebody's worked up the courage to come to you with a problem that they want your help with, and you're like, hey, don't come to me with a problem, come to me with a solution. I read that on LinkedIn. Oh, yes, I'm a great manager. Well, guess what? They're gonna run away with their tails between their legs. And next time they have a problem that you need to know about, you're not going to hear it. You're not going to hear it. You've created a chilling effect, right? And one negative experience is going to have a whole lot more impact than any number of positive experiences. You need to make sure that every experience is a positive one. So yeah, I think once people get smacked down when they try to escalate, they ain't going to escalate again. So that's just another psychological factor that compounds the previous ones that we were talking about.
And, this does come down to bad managers. As you said, Yaniv, you've got that fear, but maybe worse, you've got the experience that fear is real. So for individuals here who need to escalate that are listening to this, you need to get past that fear. And for companies that are wanting to encourage more escalation, you're going to have to make sure your managers are well trained and that you've explicitly explained in your all hands and so on, like, hey, you may have had a bad experience with this before at a previous company or at a previous stage of this company's life. We are going to change all that. So let go of that fear, let go of that past negative experience, and let's try again. That's going to be really important. I'm going to get off the mat and try again.
Over 7,000 global companies like Atlassian, Dovetail, FlowHealth, and Quora all use Vanta to manage risk and prove security in real time. Why aren't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off. I think we've talked about what escalation is, why it's important, and why it's so difficult, the gravitational factor that makes it so challenging, the psychology, the culture. So you're all sitting there listening here and going, yeah, Chris and Yaniv, we get it. It's hard, it's important, and so on. What should we do about it? How do we actually escalate well? How do we create a culture of escalation? So let's jump into that and give you a whole bunch of practical advice, starting with the people doing the escalating.
Yeah, and pretty much everybody is going to be on the side of escalating in some way, shape, or form, except maybe like the board or something, right? A product manager is going to escalate to a group product manager is going to escalate to the chief product officer chief product officer is going to escalate to the CEO is going to escalate to the board. And the board may in turn, or in some cases, escalate to the CEO and go, hey, we see there's a problem here, we need you to deal with it. And so there's really escalation all the way up. Most of you listening will need to escalate to someone at some point. So let's talk about how to escalate well. We have about 4 key bullets here. We'll go through them in order. The first is to escalate regularly, not as a last resort. And, we've touched on this, we've alluded on this throughout the whole episode, but the point is you don't just escalate when things become acute or after 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks of trying to deal with it yourself. You escalate the moment you perceive there to be a difference of opinion, a difference of perspective, a trade-off that is hard to make, and that you realize, hey, you know what? We need some higher order perspective here. We need some better taste or judgment. We need some additional context. Escalate. It should not be a big deal. It's something that might occur once a week, once every couple of weeks, and it's totally reasonable and fine to do that.
I've never worked at an organization where there is too much escalation. So I would say when in doubt, escalate. I think you will know if you're doing it too much, but it's pretty rare.
And of course, what this ultimately does is it just normalizes escalation. If it happens like once a month or once a quarter, people go, oh my God, he escalated that. This is a big deal, right? The next way to escalate well is to be precise about what you're escalating. So I can't tell you, how many times I've had inexperienced direct reports come to me and go with a general emotional state of like, oh my God, Chris, everything is broken. Or, oh my God, this guy is so frustrating. This whole thing is just completely off the rails. And it's like, pause, slow down, relax. What precisely is going on? And what precisely is the point of contention? And what precisely have you explored or tried together so far so that I can get to the bottom of this? And in some cases, I'll actually not say to them, come to me with a solution, but more so come to me with more specificity. So go back to that person, sit down with them and understand exactly what the point of contention is, and then come back to me with a little bit more specificity. Sometimes I'll do that. Sometimes it takes like more of a group meeting, but the point here is only as the one doing the escalation, try to bring as much specificity and clarity as you can to the table.
When you think about what escalation is a request for assistance, and it's a request for assistance on something specific. So you need to be able to think to yourself when you're speaking to the leader, the person who you're escalating to, what am I asking them to do? Asking them to fix everything is not a specific ask. You need to be like, okay, team A thinks thing X and team B thinks thing Y. We need you to help us resolve that. Or my team does not have enough resources to meet its OKRs. I need your help with that. Even something like, we have this problem and I really don't know how to solve it, but this is the specific problem that I don't know how to solve. I would like your input on that, right? But you need to think, what is the specific ask? Distinguish between venting and escalating. Now, there is a place, in a trusting relationship between a direct report and their manager for venting, for just going, look, I'm having a shit week, I'm having a hard time with these people, blah, 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 blah. That's not escalating, that is venting. That is sometimes you just got a bunch of emotional energy that you need to dissipate, and sometimes your manager, sometimes a coach or a mentor or someone like that is the right person to vent to. Venting is not escalation. Escalation is making a specific ask for help on something particular. And before you go in to that escalation discussion, ask yourself, what is the specific thing I'm asking for from this person?
It's okay if the specific thing you're asking for is about resolving some area of vagueness, right? So It might be like, hey, we're confused about this vague thing and we'd like help with more clarity. Or there is this weird, unknown, vague interpersonal relationship or morass going on, but it's precisely here and we need help to get to the root of it or get to the bottom of it. Your manager might still help in creating the specificity you need with you, but at least you've been clear that there is a lack of clarity. Be clear about the shape and size of this thing. And as you said, Yaniv, just to put a very fine point on that, it's not supposed to be emotional. It's not venting. It's action-oriented. It's not to say you can't vent to a manager you like and who you have a good relationship with, but those are two separate things. So those are the ways to make sure that you are escalating often and are escalating well. Then the question becomes, how should you, as a point of escalation, deal with an escalation well? You as a leader, deal with an escalation from one of your direct reports or somebody dealing with one of your direct reports.
The first thing you need to be doing is listening actively and making the person feel heard. Remember, they have had to overcome all of these cultural factors, all of these psychological factors. They have come to you. They have made an effort to escalate something to you. So the first thing to do is effectively to be respectful and to actually listen to their escalation. Don't come up with some smarty pants remark. Don't be thinking about your next meeting. Don't check your email. Listen actively and make the person feel heard. This might seem simple, But actually, it's such an important part of this. When we want to have a culture of escalation, when we talk about making sure that people don't have a negative experience, the first bit is to really make sure they feel heard, because then whatever happens after that, even if you do say, look, I'm not solving that problem for you, you need to solve it yourself, which is sometimes the right thing, it doesn't become a negative experience because at least the person has felt they've had a proper audience with you. And that is so, so important.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, we've mentioned this a few times through the episode. This is the part where you don't say, don't come to me with problems, come to me with solutions, right? That's not listening. That's not making someone feel heard. And that's just kind of abdicating your responsibility.
And in fact, just before we move on to the next one, I'd actually like to put an even finer point on this one. I think you should thank them for escalating. And we'll talk about this a bit more when we sort of talk more holistically about, as a leader, how do you create a culture of escalation? Remember, they have done something that is hard in good faith for the good of the company. You should be thanking them for that. No matter what you think of the escalation, you could separately give them feedback if, it's not specific enough or whatnot. But first say, thank you for coming to me with this. I really appreciate it.
Really, really important. The next thing to do when you are being escalated to is to be careful about the impulse to try to look for and assign blame. You've heard us say a number of times through this show, this is not necessarily about an interpersonal relationship or someone doing something wrong. It is often, very often, most often, about two well-meaning people who are highly competent, who just simply have a different perspective, a different mission, a different OKR, a different solve for a particular problem. And so there is actually no blame. This is not a failure. It's just looking for advice, for help, for guidance, for judgment. And so be careful about the tendency to look for blame and instead look for the consensus, look for the trade-off, look for the right kind of guidance. It's really about looking for people to praise about like, hey guys, I'm so glad you tried to work on that. I'm so glad you brought it to me. That's fantastic.
We could group these together as make sure it's not a negative experience, right? Once again, if you're straight away looking for blame, that makes it an unsafe situation for the person to go into. They're not going to be that keen to go into it again. The next important aspect of handling escalation well as a leader is to make sure you assume your responsibility. Don't abdicate the responsibility for making decisions for handling the escalation. Again, we were talking just before about how an escalation is a specific request. You've had that specific request brought to you as a leader. Deal with it, right? Handle it well. Don't punt it back down saying, you figure it out, or don't come to me with problems, come to me with solutions, or anything like that. It is your job to handle it, right? If you want to be a good leader in this type of organization, an organization where you have empowered teams, they come to you with these problems. It is your job to help them solve them. And so don't fluff this one. Don't just be like, oh yeah, sure, great. Let me get back to you. You need to solve this problem. And to our next point, Chris, you need to solve it fairly rapidly.
Yeah, you need to solve it. And often where this really falls down is not just when they say, well, go solve this yourself, but yeah, I'll get back to you on that. And then you don't get back to them on that, or you don't get back to them in a timely manner. And so that the rapid turnaround is a key part of your responsibility. It's a key part of handling it well. And so you need to handle it and handle it well and handle it fast so that your team isn't left spinning their wheels and wondering what the heck is going on. And so that is your responsibility. Do it well, wear the mantle of leadership well, and help your team make good decisions quickly.
Because if you think about it, what these teams are doing when they're coming to you with escalations, they're saying, we're blocked, we're stuck, we're not able to operate at full capacity, at full effectiveness because of this thing that we're escalating. And if you, as their manager, as their leader, are not there to rapidly help them get back on course and be able to operate to their fullest potential, what the hell are you even doing? This is a top priority. When it comes in, it is your job to really quite rapidly deal with it effectively. And if you're not doing that, then you are not doing your job very well. Simple as that.
We've talked about this in other episodes, but as a leader, your job is to have a vision, find or allocate funding to hire incredible people and to solve problems. That's it. Solving problems is like 1/5 of your job. And so you got to do it well. Another tip for handling escalations well, and this is one that I like a lot, Yaniv. This is one I think is less obvious. A lot of managers out there who've gone through the school of Google or Amazon or whatever. They know what escalation is. They know how to handle it. But I think not enough managers, even those who have experienced escalations, do this next bullet particularly well or consistently, which is to look for systemic reasons behind the escalation. Is there a lack of good context that you've shared with your whole team? Is there a lack of good principles? Is there a lack of clear KPIs or OKRs? Is there a missing function or role or employee? Is there an employee who has bad judgment, who's causing a lot of confusion and consternation? What is the underlying reason that the people that report to you couldn't resolve this on their own? Now, that's not to mean that it was something to blame, but if there's a trade-off that they couldn't figure out between each other, then maybe you weren't clear enough about what is the highest goal for the company or what was the key metric that you're trying to move. And so consider how you might solve the escalation tactically, but then go about adding some additional principle or KPI or OKR or goal or clarity or cultural value that makes that kind of escalation less likely to occur in the future.
Yeah, software engineers listening to this will be nodding along because this is really the concept of a blameless postmortem, right? When something goes wrong, you deal with something that goes wrong, but then you're like, why did it go wrong? Like, why was this escalation necessary? And then you put steps in place to stop it from happening so often in the future. And apart from anything else, you're doing this for your own sanity because, again, handling escalations as a leader is your job. If you don't fix the underlying root causes that are generating the escalations, well, guess what? As time passes, you're going to be dealing with more and more and more escalation. So if you value your sanity, you want to be thinking, what caused this escalation? And you should always be trying to remove the root causes. So 100% agree with that. Okay, so the final thing you need to do when you're handling escalation is to consider if you are the correct final point for handling it, or if it actually needs to be escalated even further up the hierarchy beyond yourself. Especially as a company gets a little bit bigger, you actually have multiple layers of the hierarchy. And so one of the things that might happen as a leader is if something is escalated to you, you might not be the person to directly resolve that issue. You might have to pass the escalation on. You might say, okay, I'm the manager of this team, but actually it needs to be handled by the VP for our division, right? And so then again, when we say we don't abdicate responsibility for the escalation, we say, this is still my escalation from my team. It's my responsibility to handle it. But the way I handle it is by escalating it further, of bringing it to the attention of my VP so that then they can help me solve the problem that my team has asked me to solve for them. So you can be both the escalator and the escalatee at the same time if you're in a management or a leadership role, because not everything can be solved at your level, just in the same way as when your team escalated to you, it's because it couldn't be solved at their level.
Now, as you said, Yaniv, this is not to be confused with abdicating your responsibility. This is using your responsibility to pass it up the line. It is also your responsibility to make sure it gets closed off and that your leader is doing escalation well. So you need to make sure he or she gets back to you, they get back to you in a timely manner so that you can therefore in turn get back to your team in a timely manner. Hopefully that's a helpful, very tactical list of things you can do as a leader when things get escalated to you. And then the next and final thing we want to talk about is how to generally create a great culture of escalation across your company to encourage more of this to happen and more of it to happen well.
Just to distinguish this from the previous things, Chris, in the previous couple of sections, we talked about how to escalate well and how to receive escalation well. But now we're talking about, as a company, how do you create a culture? Remember, we talked about the cultural factors and the psychological factors, the gravity that works against good escalation. So if you want a company where escalation happens often, not only do you need to have people handling it well, you need to be more broadly thinking, how do we create a culture of escalation? And there are a few things that need to happen there.
Now, of course, the first way of making a culture of escalation meaningful and important in your company is to declare it as meaningful and important in your company, right? So the first thing is to have an all hands meeting where you say to everybody, hey, this is what escalation is. Hey, here's what a good escalation looks like. Maybe listen to the startup podcast about escalation. But at this company, we now are going to do escalation and we're going to do it well. And so that's the very first thing, is to basically declare it important and to declare it desirable. And so we have to start there, right, Yaniv?
Yep. And in fact, at Circular, the startup of which I was a co-founder, we made escalation one of our company virtues. So we had values and then virtues, which were concrete behaviors aligned around our values, and escalation was one of them. And so we try to talk about it quite regularly.
Of course, the next thing you have to do is
remove the negative incentives around escalation, right? We talked about this in the How to Handle Escalation as a Leader. Listen actively, thank people, don't look for someone to blame, never make it a negative experience. So what you need to do is train people really effectively, especially your leaders, that an escalation is always something that needs to result in a positive experience for employees, and to make it part of their job. To, if you have formal job descriptions, if you have performance rubrics, you need to say handling escalations well is part of your job. So I think that's absolutely really important as step 0. Any negative incentives for escalations will kill your culture of escalation dead. I cannot emphasize that enough. A good culture of escalation is a fragile, beautiful flower. It can be killed easily. So you need to remove any conditions that will cause that to happen.
As you just touched on, the first thing is to train everybody on what we just talked about for the last 20 minutes, right? It's like how to escalate well and how to receive escalation well. As you also touched on, Yaniv, you want to bake it into performance rubrics, right? You have to say, hey, one of the factors of are you doing a good job is, are you good at escalating? Are you good at receiving escalation? And make that just part of the organizational soup. The next thing you want to do to make sure you've got a good culture of escalation is what Yaniv alluded to earlier, which is to make sure your team is rewarding and praising escalation, right? To say to people, thank you for escalating. That's very important that you escalate that. I really appreciate that, right? And to make sure everybody from the CEO down, from the board down, really, is explicitly thanking and rewarding people for escalation. It's just so easy to roll your eyes or to moan or to what have you, or just go, oh, okay, then I guess I'll deal with that. And that's kind of not the culture or the posture you want anybody to have.
Right. And that's a continuation, really, of the previous point, which we said, okay, we want to remove negative incentives around escalation. And then once we've done that, we want to start to introduce positive incentives. We want to create an organizational culture and organizational systems that actually overcome that natural gravity against escalation, right? So you've got gravity. So you're putting in trampolines everywhere, make it rocket ships, jetpacks, whatever it is, anything that helps people fight gravity and do that escalation that needs to happen. Super critical. So remove negative incentives, create positive incentives. That can be rewarding and praising. Praising in public can work effectively with the person's permission to say, hey, this person escalated this thing to us. It allowed us to make a decision, probably saved us a month worth of wasted work. Well done. That's one of the most high leverage things I could have done. And I've actually got a story that I wanted to share. I may have shared it, many episodes ago. I'd say it's one of my touchstone career stories, which was when I was early in my career at Google. I was put in charge of a project that was sponsored by Sergey Brin, one of the founders. And the problem was that it actually wasn't technically viable. I had a suspicion it wasn't technically viable. But what I did is I spent several months doing the work with my team to basically do the technical due diligence. And sure enough, it turned out not to be technically viable. And I put together a careful presentation and I presented it to people way, way, way more senior than me, saying it's not technically viable. My recommendation is we shut down the project. This was a type of escalation, I would say. I'm asking for a decision. I'm making a recommendation, but I'm asking you for a decision based on this information that I have. That may not be what you want to hear. And I was fucking terrified. I was about 1 year into my career then, 1.5 maybe. I was presenting to the most senior leaders of the Google search team, which of course is, the most powerful part of Google, apart from maybe the ads team. And I was absolutely shitting bricks. And then at the end of the meeting, Amit Singhal, who at the time was the head of Google search quality, he said, thank you for that. I wish more people had the courage to come and give us bad news. Thank you. That was 15 plus years ago. And I still remember it to this day as a career touchstone moment. Why is that? Because I was worried about a negative experience and instead I received a positive experience. I received praise. If anything, it accelerated my career development. And so you absolutely have to create that culture where senior leaders in group settings are saying, thank you for doing that difficult thing. It makes such a huge difference.
Actually, I want to give a couple of examples that are related to that, Yaniv. The first is you talked about praising in public. What I'll often do is I will actually praise the escalation and mention the escalation in public anonymously. So I'll say, I've had some people raise this to me, and I really appreciate that they did that. If they want to speak up here and put their hand up that they did this, that's fine. Otherwise, we'll keep it anonymous. And often they'll just go, that was me. And, they kind of let them out themselves, but deal with the issue in public anyway and praise it in public. But on the question of senior leaders making it a really pleasant experience, actually, friend of the pod, who's been on many, many Reacts episodes, he's part of the furniture, Emil Michael, he was actually the senior leader with a group of people who are at odds with my project, right? So his whole department was a main, for lack of a better term, antagonist or on the opposite side of an issue that I was pushing. It got escalated, basically to Emil. And we didn't know each other then. It was my first meeting with Emil. And he was, big, scary Emil, Travis's best friend, chief business officer. He took me aside in a side meeting before the meeting. And I thought I was going to get ripped to shreds because I thought he's probably heard about this from his team. They probably feel like I'm creating a lot of problems. And I thought he was going to basically tell me to sit down and shut up and who do I think I am? Emil was the kindest, gentlest person who said, hey, I heard you're having real trouble with getting this through with my team and aligning with my team, et cetera, et cetera. I hope it hasn't been too unpleasant. I apologize that we haven't been able to figure this out. I'm really looking forward to the next meeting, and we're going to figure this out together. It just blew my mind. I learned so much about leadership, about Emil, about Uber from that meeting. It really meaningful and material change to my worldview. I don't know if I ever thanked Emil for that one-on-one, but I should do that in one of the episodes. But yeah, it was really meaningful, really important. So that's a big part of how to create a culture of escalation. Finally, a key part of making a culture of escalation popular, well accepted, and efficient at your organization is actually to have a really clear and effective org chart. Because escalation is about asking for help from leaders, right? Sometimes your leader, sometimes someone else's leader. And so you need to be really clear about who the leaders are and who someone else's leader is. And so make sure that there is a clear org chart, not just a reporting chart, but also a cross-functional org chart, so that you know who is interacting with who reports to who, and who is the right point of escalation for any particular issue. This is more important than you might expect. I see a lot of companies that have kind of crossed this threshold from, small handful of people to scale up, and they haven't spent anywhere near enough time rethinking their org chart, both the reporting lines and the cross-functional teams. They're way underweight, they're way understructured, and there's no clear sense of who's doing what and for who. This has turned into some 20 or 30% of my advisory work is helping scale-ups reorg their team and understand their real resource requirements, but understand also their real reporting lines and real job descriptions. It's a very important thing that often goes underinvested in or overlooked.
Organizational charts are one of those things that, again, when people threw out the idea of a command and control top-down hierarchy, too often they threw out the idea of a hierarchy at all. And a good hierarchy is supportive, in fact, to the people who you are trying to empower. Without it, what you get is not like utopia of freedom and empowerment. What you get is chaos and anarchy. So design your org chart, and you're optimizing for a number of different things, but absolutely, Chris, one of the key things you need to be optimizing for is having effective paths of escalation. And if you haven't done that, if you haven't designed your org chart, you're going to get an anarchic shadow org chart that's going to make everything more difficult.
All right, Yaniv, that is the show. We've talked all about escalation, what it is, why it's important, why it's difficult, how to do it well, and ultimately how to create a great culture of escalation at your company. We'd love for you to join us in the comments, talk about your case studies of escalation that went well, escalation that went poorly, tips and tricks for how to do escalation well, and we'll join you down there and have a conversation about it as well.
God damn, Chris, I'm exhausted from doing that episode. That was dense. And I don't know about you if you're exhausted too, but all I want in return is for people to like and subscribe to us in their favorite listening app, follow us on YouTube, and give us a shout out wherever it is that you have an audience. That's the Startup Podcast Pact. That's all we ask in return for this heavy labor. So thanks so much to all of you who've already honored the pact. Okay, so like you said, Chris, an increasing part of your business is helping people design org charts and cultures that support effective operation, including escalation. So if you're a leader and you're looking at your company and going, oh boy, we need help with our org chart, I want Chris to help me, how can people work with you?
Yeah, that's right. And I work with companies to redefine these org charts, redesign these ways of working, and ultimately to land key cultural issues and mechanisms like escalation. So feel free to learn more about that over at chrissaad.com/advisory. You can also subscribe to my newsletter over at chrissaad.com/newsletter. All right, Yaniv, that was great. Catch you in the next one.
Yep, it was a lot of fun, Chris. Have a good one. Today's episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Vanta. Vanta automates compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. Over 7,000 global companies already use Vanta. Why don't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off.